Everyone expected our marriage of convenience to fail, and for a while, they were right. That's the sentence people repeat when they talk about us now, usually with a softened smile, like the ending was always inevitable, like love had simply been late to the party. But when I say they were right, I don't mean it poetically. I mean it literally. For months, our marriage felt like a quiet, carefully managed mistake. I remember the sound of our apartment more than anything else in those early days. Not arguments, not laughter, just silence. Thick, polite, disciplined silence. The kind that exists when two adults are determined not to need each other. Jasper Harvey and I lived together like people sharing a very expensive waiting room. We slept in the same space, yes, but even that had rules. Rules were Jasper's idea, and, to my surprise, I had agreed to all of them. No emotional expectations, no public displays of affection unless required, no interference in each other's personal routines, and most importantly, absolute respect. "It's not that I don't care," he had said the first night, standing near the window instead of the bed, hands in his pockets like he was about to deliver a business presentation. "It's that I don't want to cross lines you didn't invite me to cross." At the time, I found that comforting. This wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't an arranged marriage in the traditional sense, though people liked to call it that. No one forced us. There were no families negotiating dowries or cultural expectations pressing in on us. What we had was simpler and colder. A marriage without love. A solution. I was 38 years old and exhausted by uncertainty, by dating that required emotional acrobatics, by men who wanted intensity but not intention. I didn't want passion that burned out. I wanted stability that stayed. Jasper wanted something else, but adjacent. He needed a marriage for reasons he never fully explained at first. Professional ones, social ones, clean ones, the kind that didn't require emotional exposure. So we met in the middle. A loveless marriage. A marriage of convenience. Predictable. Controlled. Safe. At least that's what I told myself. If you're still watching this story unfold, if you're sitting somewhere in New York or Toronto or maybe a quiet town you've never seen represented in a movie, let me pause here for a moment. Stories like this only work because someone is listening. So before we go any further, if you believe in second chances, in emotional growth, in real hearts navigating real mistakes, consider subscribing to Possible Hearts. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It still amazes me how far these stories travel. Now, back to the silent. Jasper was not cold. That's the mistake everyone makes when they hear this part. He was careful. He remembered my preferences before I did. The way I liked my coffee but never made for myself. The exact angle I preferred the lamps so the light didn't feel aggressive in the evenings. When I worked late, he left food in the fridge without commentary, without expectation, care without claim. That was his specialty. And yet he never touched me unless it was unavoidable, never brushed past me in the kitchen, never let his hand linger when we handed each other things. If our shoulders accidentally met, he apologized, as if contact itself were a breach of contract. We looked married from the outside. Inside, we were emotionally distant roommates performing a role. For a while, that balance held. It almost fooled me into believing we were immune to complications. There were no fights because there were no expectations, no disappointment because we had agreed not to hope. But safety has a cost, and the first time I felt it was the night I realized I was watching him too closely. We were sitting across from each other at dinner, the soft hum of the city slipping in through a cracked window. Jasper was listening to me talk about something inconsequential. Work, I think. He nodded at the right moments, asked the right questions, and then his gaze stayed on me half a second too long. Not intense, not obvious, just present. Something tightened in my chest. He noticed it too. I could tell by the way he leaned back, subtly re-establishing distance, like a man correcting his posture after leaning into something dangerous. I think we should stick closely to the agreement, he said calmly, as if he were reminding himself as much as me. I laughed it off. Of course, that's why we're doing this. But later that night, lying inches apart in the dark, I stared at the ceiling and felt something I hadn't planned for. Not desire, awareness. And somewhere in that quiet space between us, I sensed the beginning of a fracture neither of us was ready to name. Because while everyone expected our marriage to fail, I was just starting to understand that the real danger wasn't failure. It was what might happen if one of us stopped pretending this didn't matter. And that was when Jasper began to pull away. If our marriage had been a sound, it would have been the steady ticking of a clock. Not loud enough to be annoying, not dramatic enough to demand attention, just constant, marking time, reminding us that something was passing even if nothing seemed to be happening. From the outside, we looked fine. Better than fine, actually. People stopped asking questions after the first few weeks. Jasper was reliable, polite, attentive in public. He remembered anniversaries that weren't even real. He touched my lower back at the right moments at dinners, stood close enough to suggest intimacy without ever risking it. If someone had asked me then whether I felt neglected, I would have said no. That would have been the truth, but it wouldn't have been the whole one. Our marriage of convenience worked because it was intentionally uneventful. There were no arguments about money because we had outlined expenses down to categories. No disagreements about time because we maintained separate schedules. No jealousy because neither of us appeared to want anything more. It was a silent marriage, but not an unhappy one. At least, that's what I told myself. We developed routines that felt oddly domestic. Sunday mornings at the same cafe, grocery shopping done efficiently, almost companionably, evenings where we shared the couch, not touching but existing in parallel, like two people reading different books under the same lamp. Sometimes I caught myself thinking, this is enough. That thought scared me more than dissatisfaction ever had, because enough is a dangerous word when it comes to the heart. Jasper never crossed the line. Not once, and that discipline, his restraint, began to unsettle me, not because I wanted him to break the rules, but because I sensed how much effort it took him to keep them. He noticed everything. The way my voice softened when I was tired, the way I avoided mirrors on certain mornings. Once, after a long day, I came home to find the bathtub already running, the lights dimmed low, a folded towel waiting. "I thought you might want quiet tonight," he said, already turning back to his laptop, as if kindness were something he needed to deliver and then step away from quickly. I thanked him. I always did. But that night, submerged in warm water, I cried without understanding why. There were moments, small, fleeting, that felt charged in ways I refused to name. Like the time I laughed unexpectedly at something he said, and he froze for half a second, his expression unreadable. Or the way he sometimes watched me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, only to look away the instant I noticed. Repressed attraction has a particular gravity to it. You feel it before you admit it. I told myself it was just proximity, just habit. We had married without love. It was natural for boundaries to blur slightly over time. That explanation worked until it didn't. The first real crack appeared on an ordinary Tuesday. We were attending a small professional gathering. Nothing formal, just colleagues and acquaintances. Jasper was in his element, composed, understated, quietly impressive. I stood beside him, playing my role with practiced ease. That's when I noticed her. She wasn't doing anything wrong. That was the worst part. She laughed at Jasper's comments a little too warmly, asked him questions that lingered past their answers, leaned in, not enough to be inappropriate, but enough to signal interest. I felt something sharp twist inside me, jealousy. The realization hit me so hard it almost knocked the breath from my lungs. I had no right to feel it. We had agreed to emotional distance, to freedom, to not wanting. And yet, there it was, raw and unmistakable. I watched Jasper carefully, expecting him to enjoy the attention, to respond. He didn't. If anything, he withdrew. His smile became polite, his posture closed. When she touched his arm lightly, he stepped back, not abruptly, but deliberately, as if reminding himself where he stood. When we got home that night, he was quieter than usual. The apartment felt different, tighter. The next morning, he left earlier than normal, came home later, rearranged his routine without explanation. Distance where there had been comfort. I told myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew better. This wasn't indifference. This was control, and it was slipping. I finally asked him about it 3 days later, my voice calm, even as my chest felt unsteady. "You've been different," I said. "Did I do something?" He looked at me for a long moment, long enough to make the silence heavy. "No," he said carefully, "you didn't." Then, after a pause that felt loaded with meaning, he added, "I just think it's important we don't drift from what we agreed to." The words were measured, reasonable, but his eyes told another story. Fear, not of me, of wanting something he wasn't sure he was allowed to want. And as he walked past me, creating space between us with deliberate precision, a thought settled into my chest, quiet, unwelcome, and undeniable. This marriage wasn't failing because it lacked love. It was failing because we were both pretending love wasn't already asking to be seen. And I had the sudden, terrifying sense that if one of us took another step back, there might be no way to close the distance again. Distance doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it slips in disguised as consideration. Jasper didn't announce that he was pulling away. He didn't accuse, didn't blame, didn't even change his tone. He simply recalibrated, like a man adjusting the volume down on something that had gotten too loud inside his own head. He started coming home later. Not dramatically late, just late enough that dinner no longer felt like a shared ritual. He left earlier, too, often before I woke up, his side of the bed already cool when my alarm went off. Notes replaced conversations. "Long day, hope you slept well." Meetings ran over, "don't wait up." They were considerate messages, thoughtful, and somehow lonelier than silence. At first, I respected it, or told myself I did. This was what we'd agreed to, wasn't it? Emotional distance, independence, a marriage without love, without expectation. If anything, Jasper was honoring the rules better than I was. That realization stung. I became hyper-aware of my own reactions, how I listened for his keys at night, how I noticed the exact minute he arrived home, how disappointment settled in my chest when I realized I'd missed him again. It felt absurd. You wanted this, I reminded myself. You chose safety. But safety, I was learning, can start to feel like absence. One evening, I found him in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, staring at nothing. The city lights filtered in through the window, outlining his profile in soft gold. "Hey," I said gently. He startled, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. "Hey," he replied, straightening. "I didn't hear you come in." "You've been quiet," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Even for us." A flicker crossed his face, something like hesitation. "I'm just trying to make sure we don't complicate things unnecessarily," he said. There it was again. We. As if the distance were a joint decision, not something he was carrying alone. Did something happen? At the event the other night, maybe? His jaw tightened, not defensively, but deliberately. "No." Then, after a moment, "But I did realize something." I waited. That this arrangement works best when it stays exactly what it is. The words landed with more weight than he intended. "And what is that?" I asked quietly. "A marriage of convenience, not any millennial marriage, not anything confusing." I laughed softly, though nothing felt funny. "You make it sound like we're on the verge of doing something reckless." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time since I'd known him, he didn't hide what was in his eyes. Fear. Some things are reckless because they matter. The room felt suddenly too small. I wanted to ask him what he meant, wanted to push, to name what was hovering between us like unfinished music. But I didn't.
because pushing meant risking an answer I wasn't sure I was ready to hear.
After that night, the distance became official. He rearranged his schedule so we rarely overlapped. When we did cross paths, he was polite, attentive, careful in ways that felt almost painful. He stopped sitting beside me on the couch, stopped initiating shared routines, stopped asking questions that went beyond logistics. It was like watching someone dismantle a bridge plank by plank, slowly, responsibly, without drama. And the worst part? He was doing it to protect himself. I noticed it one morning when I mentioned a colleague, a man I worked with, casually, without thought. Jasper's reaction was immediate but controlled, a tightening around the eyes, a pause before he responded. "I didn't realize you were spending time with him," he said, neutrally. "We're not. We just worked late on a project." He nodded once, said nothing else. But that night, he didn't come home until after midnight. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about disinterest. This was about restraint. Jasper wasn't pulling away because he felt nothing. He was pulling away because he felt too much and didn't believe he had the right to. The realization unsettled me deeply. Because while he was busy managing his emotions with discipline and distance, mine were quietly rearranging my priorities. I started noticing the absence more than the peace. The quiet dinners, the empty space beside me, the way the apartment felt colder without his presence filling it, even silently. And for the first time since we married without love, I felt something dangerously close to loss. I finally confronted him on a night when the air felt heavy with unsaid things. "Are you trying to disappear from this marriage?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his words were careful, almost painfully so. "I'm trying not to take something that was never offered." The sentence echoed in my chest. "What if it was?" I asked before I could stop myself. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment, the distance collapsed. Then he stepped back. "That's exactly the kind of question we shouldn't be asking," he said quietly. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. Jasper was already preparing to lose this marriage, not because it was failing, but because he was afraid of wanting me alone. And if I didn't speak soon, if I didn't decide what I was willing to risk, I might wake up one morning and find that he'd chosen distance permanently. There's a particular kind of fear that arrives when you realize you can lose something you never admitted you wanted. It doesn't scream, it settles. After that conversation, Jasper became almost unbearably considerate. Not distant in the obvious ways, no coldness, no sharpness, just intentional absence. Like a man who knew exactly where the edge was and refused to let himself lean even an inch past it. And somehow that restraint hurt more than rejection ever could have. I began noticing things I hadn't before. The quiet competence with which he moved through shared spaces. The way he always made sure I had what I needed before thinking of himself. The care he showed without ever demanding acknowledgement. This wasn't emotional neglect, this was emotional discipline, and it was breaking something open inside me. The situation escalated the night we attended a dinner hosted by one of Jasper's professional contacts. It was a smaller gathering, intimate enough to require real conversation, the kind where people observe you closely, draw conclusions, test boundaries. That's when she appeared again. Her name was Evelyn. She was accomplished, confident, and unmistakably interested in Jasper. This time, it wasn't subtle. She positioned herself beside him, asked questions meant only for him, laughed with an ease that suggested familiarity, even though they'd only met once before. I watched from across the table, my chest tightening with each exchanged glance. And then, something unexpected happened. Jasper shut it down. Not rudely, not dramatically, but unmistakably. He redirected conversations, created physical distance. When she touched his arm again, he stepped away and looked almost unconsciously toward me.
The look was brief, but it was loaded. Later, in the car, silence pressed in around us. "You don't have to be so careful," I said, finally, hating how tight my voice sounded. We didn't agree to exclusivity. He didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was low, controlled. "I know." A pause. "That doesn't mean I don't have limits." I turned toward him. "Limits for what?" "For myself," he said. That night, he didn't retreat. Instead, he sat across from me in the living room, posture tense, hands clasped as if holding something in place. "There's something I need to say, and I need to say it carefully." My pulse quickened. "I don't regret this marriage," he said, "but I won't pretend I don't feel the weight of it changing." I swallowed. "Changing how?" He exhaled slowly. "I'm starting to want things I never agreed to want." The words landed heavily between us. "And you think the solution is to create more distance?" I asked. "I think the solution is to not put you in a position where you feel obligated to give something you didn't offer." That was the moment it hit me fully. Jasper wasn't afraid of intimacy. He was afraid of humiliation. Afraid of desiring someone who only accepted him because it was convenient. Afraid of becoming emotionally exposed in a marriage that started without love. "Do you think I don't notice?" I asked quietly. "The way you pull back every time something feels real?" He met my gaze. "Do you think I don't notice that you haven't chosen me?" The honesty in his voice stole my breath. "I didn't think I had to," I admitted. "That's exactly the problem," he said softly. Silence followed. Not hostile, not defensive, just painfully honest. That night, he made a suggestion that cracked something open inside me. "Maybe," he said, voice steady despite the weight of his words, "we should consider whether continuing this marriage makes sense, if it's starting to demand more than we promised each other." I stared at him. "You're suggesting we end it?" "I'm suggesting," he corrected, "that I'd rather lose this marriage cleanly than stay and want you alone." The room felt suddenly unstable, because in that moment I understood something terrifying. Jasper was prepared to walk away, not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much to beg. And as I sat there, heart pounding, watching the man I had married without love prepared to leave with dignity intact, I realized I was standing at the edge of a truth I could no longer avoid. The risk wasn't loving Jasper. The risk was continuing to pretend that this marriage didn't already matter to me. And if I didn't speak soon, I wouldn't just lose him. I would lose the version of myself brave enough to choose something real. The days after Jasper suggested we reconsider the marriage felt unreal, like I'd stepped into a version of my life that hadn't been rehearsed. Nothing ended, nothing officially changed, and yet everything had shifted. We moved around each other with the careful awareness of people standing near a fragile object. Conversations became softer. Glances lingered just long enough to be dangerous. It was as if we both understood that one wrong word could push us into a decision neither of us was ready to finalize. Jasper didn't pressure me. That was the hardest part. He didn't repeat his suggestion, didn't demand clarity, didn't ask where I stood. Instead, he gave me space, the kind that feels respectful on the surface and devastating underneath. Space to choose. I started noticing the cost of my silence everywhere. In the mornings, when I woke up alone more often than not. In the evenings, when I cooked for one out of habit and then felt foolish when I remembered I wasn't actually alone. In the way my phone stayed silent because the man I wanted to talk to refused to overstep. This wasn't emotional manipulation. This was integrity, and it forced me to confront something I had avoided my entire adult life. I was comfortable being chosen as long as I didn't have to choose back. Stability without vulnerability, acceptance without exposure, a marriage without love, because love demanded too much truth. Jasper, in contrast, was quietly preparing himself for loss. I saw it in the small ways. how he began organizing his personal documents, how he stopped adding things to shared calendars, how he spoke about the future with careful neutrality, as if no longer assuming he had a place in mine. One evening, I found him on the balcony, city lights flickering behind him, a glass of water untouched in his hand. Are you planning to leave? I asked. He turned slowly. I'm planning to be ready if you decide you don't want this anymore. The words cut deeper than any argument could have. And what if I do want this? I asked. He searched my face, not hopefully, not defensively, just honestly. Then I need to know it's because you choose me, he said, not because this arrangement is comfortable. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake replaying moments I had dismissed as harmless, the jealousy I hadn't acknowledged, the fear I had hidden behind logic, the way my heart reacted before my mind could intervene. We had married without love, but something had grown anyway, unplanned, unspoken, unprotected. The truth was unavoidable now. Our marriage, as it began, could not survive. It was built on fear disguised as practicality, on two people protecting themselves from different kinds of pain. Jasper was afraid of wanting alone. I was afraid of choosing wrong. And silence, my silence, was choosing for both of us. The breaking point came unexpectedly. I arrived home one evening to find the apartment unusually neat, not cleaned, cleared, his side of the closet thinned, books stacked in careful piles. Not gone, but prepared. My chest tightened. Are you doing this because of me? I asked, my voice barely steady. He nodded once. Because of us. I stepped closer. Jasper, I never said I didn't want you. You never said you did, he replied gently. The restraint in his voice shattered something in me. I realized then that love doesn't begin with fireworks or declarations. Sometimes it begins with the terrifying moment you understand what you stand to lose. And for the first time since this marriage of convenience began, I was no longer afraid of losing control. I was afraid of losing him. The decision pressed against my chest, demanding to be made. Because if I didn't speak now, if I didn't choose intentionally, Jasper would walk away with his dignity intact, and I would be left with a marriage that ended not because it failed, but because I was too afraid to admit it mattered.
The night everything finally broke open didn't arrive with thunder or raised voices. It arrived quietly. Jasper had packed a small overnight bag, not enough to leave forever, enough to make a point. He stood near the door, jacket on, keys in hand, posture steady, too steady, like a man bracing himself against something he had already decided to endure. I'm not moving out, he said before I could speak. I just need space for a day or two. For what? I asked. To give you room to decide without me standing in front of you. The words landed like a blow. You're leaving so I can choose? I asked. I'm leaving so you don't feel watched while you do. I crossed the room without thinking, stopping a few feet away from him, close enough to feel his presence, not close enough to touch. This feels like an ending, I said. It might be, and I need to know I can survive that. Something inside me fractured. You don't have to protect me from yourself, I said, my voice unsteady now. I'm not that fragile. His expression softened, not with relief, but with sadness. I'm not protecting you, he said quietly. I'm protecting myself from wanting you alone. There it was again, that truth he refused to dilute. Do you have any idea how unfair that is? You keep acting like I've already decided against you. I'm acting like I respect your right not to choose me. Those are not the same thing. I shook my head, overwhelmed. You're making this sound so final. Because half choices hurt more than endings, he replied. Silence stretched between us, heavy with everything we had never said. And in that silence, I understood something with terrifying clarity. Jasper wasn't leaving to manipulate me. He was leaving because staying without being chosen would eventually destroy him.
That was the moment fear gave way to something sharper, regret. I don't know how to do this, I admitted. Choosing someone feels dangerous. I know, he said softly. He reached for the door handle, and panic surged through me. Not dramatic, not cinematic, real, physical. Wait, I said. His hand froze. I need to say something, my heart hammering, and I don't know how it's supposed to sound. He turned slowly, cautious now, as if afraid to hope. I married you because it felt safe, because a marriage without love seemed manageable. He listened without interrupting. But somewhere along the way, that safety turned into something else, something heavier, something I didn't ask for and didn't protect myself against. My throat tightened. I started noticing when you weren't there, started caring about who looked at you, started feeling like the ground shifted every time you pulled away. He took a step toward me, then stopped himself. I didn't plan to love you, I said, and I don't even know if that's the right word yet. His jaw clenched. But I do know this, I continued. When you talk about leaving, it doesn't feel like losing an arrangement. It feels like losing you. The air between us felt charged, fragile.
Jasper closed his eyes briefly, as if steadying himself. Sasha, he said quietly, I can't be the man you almost choose. I know, I replied. That's what terrifies me. I took a breath, deep, deliberate. I'm not asking you to stay because I'm afraid of being alone, I said. I'm asking you to stay because I'm finally afraid of not choosing. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time, I saw how close he was to breaking. You're asking me to trust you with something you've never offered before, he said. Yes, I whispered. And you might change your mind. Yes. He exhaled slowly. That's a risk. I know. We stood there, suspended in that moment. This was it, the edge. I don't know how to promise forever, I said, but I know I don't want this marriage to end because I was too afraid to step into it fully. His voice was barely audible when he replied, Are you choosing me or choosing the idea of choosing? I swallowed. I'm choosing you, even if I have to learn how to do it out loud. The room seemed to hold its breath. Jasper set the bag down slowly, didn't smile, didn't move closer. Instead, he said something that shattered any illusion of an easy resolution. Then we can't go back to how this was. I nodded. I know. If I stay, this becomes real, vulnerable, messy. No agreements to hide behind. I know, I said again, stronger this time. And if we do this, he finished, it will hurt if it fails. I met his gaze. It already hurts pretending it doesn't matter. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, stay with me tonight. Not as an agreement, not as convenience. My heart pounded. But as a beginning we don't get to control. I nodded. Yes. But even as the word left my mouth, I knew something important. This wasn't the end of the conflict. It was the point of no return. Because choosing Jasper meant facing everything I had spent years avoiding. And as he reached for me, not touching yet, just close enough to feel, I realized the real test of our marriage wasn't whether it could survive without love, but whether it could survive with it. Choosing someone is not the same as knowing how to love them. I learned that in the days after Jasper stayed. Nothing dramatic happened that first night. No sweeping confessions, no sudden physical intimacy to seal the decision. We went to bed like we always had, on opposite sides, careful, restrained, but everything felt different. The silence no longer felt neutral. It felt expectant. When I woke the next morning, Jasper was already awake, sitting at the edge of the bed, elbows resting on his knees. He looked tired,
Not from lack of sleep, but from vigilance, as if staying had cost him something he was still learning how to spend. I meant what I said last night, he told me quietly. We can't pretend anymore. I nodded. I don't want to. Then we need to talk about what this actually means, because wanting each other without clarity is how people get hurt. There it was again. His integrity, his insistence on truth, even when it complicated things. So we talked. Not like lovers, like two adults dismantling a structure they'd lived inside. We talked about fear, about how I associated intense love with instability, about how he associated wanting with rejection. We talked about the fact that we'd both been hiding behind the idea of a marriage without love, because it allowed us to belong without risking our pride. At some point, I realized something uncomfortable. Jasper had been emotionally honest long before I was. I had simply benefited from his restraint. That realization followed me through the day, through the week, through every moment we tried to move forward without a script. We began doing things differently. He sat closer on the couch, but didn't touch me until I reached for his hand. He looked at me openly now, no longer correcting himself when his gaze lingered, and that openness terrified me, because now there was no agreement to retreat into. Every moment mattered, every reaction carried weight, and then came the consequences. The first fight we ever had didn't start with anger, it started with misunderstanding. A colleague invited me out for drinks after work, something I'd done dozens of times before without a second thought. I told Jasper casually, expecting nothing more than acknowledgement. Instead, his expression closed. "You're going?" he asked, confused. "Why wouldn't I?" He nodded once. "No reason." But the air shifted. Later that night, when I came home, he was distant, polite, controlled, quiet in a way that felt painfully familiar. "Talk to me," I said finally. "I don't want to make assumptions, but this is new territory for me." "For me too," I said. "That doesn't mean we retreat." His jaw tightened. "I'm not retreating. I'm trying not to demand reassurance I haven't earned." The words hit me hard, because I recognized myself in them. "I don't want to be managed," I said softly. "And I don't want to manage you." Silence followed. Then, unexpectedly, his composure cracked. "I don't know how to want you with fear," he admitted. "Every time I feel it, I brace for the moment you realize you chose wrong." The vulnerability in his voice undid me. I stepped closer. "And every time you pull away, I feel like I've already failed." We stood there, both exposed, both uncertain. This was the cost of choosing. No safety net, no roles, no distance. Just two people learning to stay present, even when fear resurfaced. That night, for the first time, Jasper touched me without hesitation. Not urgently, not possessively, just honestly. His hand on my back, my forehead against his chest. No declarations, no promises. But something shifted, subtly, irrevocably. We weren't pretending anymore. And that made everything harder and better. The final test came sooner than I expected. A message arrived on Jasper's phone while it sat on the table between us. A woman's name, familiar, Evelyn. He didn't hide it, didn't reach for the phone, just looked at me, open, uncertain. "I told her I was married," he said quietly, "that I was choosing this." My heart pounded, and he answered immediately. "I said I was choosing risk." Something inside me softened and steadied, because for the first time, we were standing on the same ground, not protected, not guaranteed, but honest. And as we sat there, side by side, I understood the truth we'd both been circling since the beginning. Our marriage of convenience had failed, but something far more fragile and far more real was finally taking its place. And if this was going to work, it wouldn't be because it was safe it would be because every day we chose not to run.
Love didn't arrive all at once. There was no single morning where I woke up certain, no dramatic moment where fear disappeared. What came instead was quieter and more demanding: consistency. Choosing Jasper didn't end my fear, it ended my excuses. The days that followed weren't magically easier. In many ways, they were harder than anything that came before, because now every choice carried emotional weight. Every silence meant something. Every kindness mattered because it wasn't required by an agreement anymore. It was intentional. We stopped performing marriage and started learning it. There were mornings when I caught myself retreating into old habits, overanalyzing his tone, bracing for withdrawal. And there were moments when Jasper still pulled back instinctively, his body remembering restraint before his heart caught up. But now we named it. "I'm scared," he would say, or I would. And instead of distance, we offered presence. That was new. One evening, weeks later, we sat at the same cafe where we'd once looked like strangers playing house. This time, our hands rested on the table, close, not touching. No performance, no audience. "Do you ever miss how simple it was?" I asked. He considered the question carefully. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I don't miss how alone I felt inside it." Neither did I. Because the truth was, our marriage without love had been efficient, but lonely. A silent marriage dressed up as maturity. Emotional distance disguised as control. What we were building now was messier and alive. I began to understand something I'd resisted my entire life. Love isn't destabilizing because it's intense. It's destabilizing because it asks you to participate, to risk being wrong, to risk being chosen and choosing back. One night, months later, Jasper said something that finally reframed everything for me. "I think I started loving you before you ever realized it," he said. "Not because I expected anything, but because I was already fighting to lose you." That landed gently, truthfully, because that was the part no one saw. Before I ever admitted what I felt, Jasper had already been protecting something fragile, not the agreement, us. Everyone expected our marriage of convenience to fail, and they were right. That version couldn't survive. It was never meant to. But what replaced it wasn't a fairy tale. It was an emotional marriage, built slowly, deliberately, without illusions. A marriage that acknowledged fear instead of pretending it didn't exist. A marriage that began not with romance, but with responsibility. Responsibility for our own hearts. We didn't rebuild overnight. We didn't erase the past or pretend we hadn't hurt each other with our restraint. We learned. We apologized. We stayed. And somewhere in that process, love stopped feeling like a threat and started feeling like a choice we made daily. If you're listening to this story and recognizing pieces of yourself in it, if you've ever chosen safety over vulnerability, convenience over clarity, know this: love doesn't begin when everything feels certain. It begins when you stop protecting yourself from the very thing you want. We married without love, and for a long time I thought that meant we had already failed. But now I understand something different. Love didn't begin when we said "I do." It began when we stopped pretending we didn't care, when we chose each other, not because it was safe, but because it was real. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Possible Hearts. It helps these stories reach the people who need them most. And if you're comfortable, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Real stories, real hearts, real possibilities.